They dismissed her as base cleaner. Until a nuclear sub surfaced flying her personal flag, the transfer papers arrived in the second week of November 1987, and Margaret Collis read them 3 times before she set them down on the kitchen table. 31 years old. Petty Officer 2nd Class, United States Navy. Stationed at Naval Submarine Base New London, Groton, Connecticut, for the past 4 years. And now, effective December 1st, reassigned to base maintenance operations. Janitorial Division, Building 43. The envelope was stamped with a routine administrative seal. No note. No explanation beyond the reassignment code. She put the papers back in the envelope. Went to the window. Outside, the Thames River sat flat and gray under a low November sky, the kind of cold that doesn't move. Margaret had been the only female logistics technician in her squadron. Had been until 11 days ago, when Lieutenant Commander Gerald Foss had submitted her reassignment request to the base personnel office, and it had been approved inside of 48 hours. That part wasn't in the papers. She'd learned it from Chief Petty Officer Donna Rollins, who'd heard it from the yeoman who processed the paperwork. By the time it reached Margaret, it had traveled through 4 people and still arrived intact. Foss hadn't spoken to her directly about it. Hadn't needed to. She folded the envelope and put it in the second drawer of her dresser under a wool sweater she'd bought in New Haven the previous winter. Then she reported to Building 43 on December 1st at 0600, as ordered, and asked the duty supervisor where she should start. He handed her a mop and pointed at the corridor outside the officer's wardroom. She started there. Building 43 housed administrative offices, 2 briefing rooms, and the wardroom where officers took their meals when operational schedules pulled them off the submarines. The floors were poured concrete-painted battleship gray. The walls were institutional green, the paint thick enough in places that old nail holes had completely disappeared. The corridor ran 140 feet from the entry doors to the back emergency exit. Margaret mopped it every morning, 6 days a week. Starting at 0530, finishing by 0700, so the corridor was dry before the first officers arrived for the 0730 briefing. The work wasn't difficult. It wasn't challenging. It required a bucket, a wringer, a standard naval-issue industrial mop, and a bottle of Zepp floor cleaner diluted at the rate printed on the label. Margaret mopped the corridor in 7 overlapping passes, changed the water once at the midpoint, and was done in 40 minutes. The rest of her shift covered the 2 briefing rooms, the head near the eastern entrance, and the supply closet that doubled as the duty supervisor's office. Full sweep, top to bottom, Monday through Saturday. The duty supervisor was a retired E6 named Hartwell, who had worked base maintenance for 3 years and spoke primarily in single-syllable instructions. He did not ask Margaret what her previous assignment had been. He did not appear interested in knowing. By the end of the first week, she had identified 6 things the previous maintenance rotation had been doing incorrectly, including a ventilation grate in Briefing Room B that was packed solid with dust and hadn't been cleaned in what looked like months. She cleaned it without being asked. Noted it in the maintenance log in the entry on December 7, 1987. Hartwell didn't comment on the entry. Margaret kept the log anyway. She had been in building maintenance for 3 weeks when she first noticed the flags. Briefing Room A had them mounted on the back wall, 7 naval ensigns, 1 divisional flag for the submarine squadron, and 3 command pennants representing boats that had been decommissioned before 1979. They were mounted on a single horizontal rail with brass hooks, and 2 of them had loose stitching along the heading where the grommets attached. One had a small tear in the canton, upper left, the size of a thumbnail, that had been patched with iron on backing and then apparently forgotten. Margaret had been issued no instructions about the flags. She asked Hartwell about them on her 19th day, asked whether they fell under maintenance responsibility or whether they were handled by the squadron yeoman's office. Hartwell looked at the flags, said he didn't know, told her to leave them alone unless someone told her otherwise. She left them alone. For now, the flags had been on the wall since at least 1983, based on the photograph she found in a manila folder in the bottom of the supply closet, a black and white shot of the briefing room taken during some kind of inspection, the flags visible in the background, already hanging where they were now. 4 years on the same hooks. Dust on the grommets, a torn canton someone had tried to patch and then forgotten about. Margaret went back to her corridor. In late January 1988, a submarine came in early. US Greenville had been scheduled to return from a training deployment on February 3rd. It pulled into the Thames River Basin on January 28th instead, 6 days ahead of schedule. Something about a mechanical issue with the number 2 diesel that had been caught during a routine check at sea. The crew needed to offload. The maintenance crews needed access. Base operations compressed 3 days of preparation into about 14 hours. Margaret spent that 14 hours mopping the same corridor she mopped every morning. Except she mopped it twice. Once at 0530, as usual, and once at 1400 when a lieutenant she didn't recognize walked through and tracked hydraulic fluid from one end to the other without appearing to notice. The hydraulic fluid left a dark smear across 40 feet of freshly cleaned concrete. She mopped it up without commenting on it. That same afternoon, Hartwell told her the wardroom briefing schedule was being extended through the evening, and she'd need to come back at 2000 to clean the head and reset the chairs in briefing room A for the 0600 briefing the next morning. She came back at 2000. The flags were crooked. 3 of them had been shifted on their hooks when someone, she didn't know who, had moved a folding chair against the wall for the afternoon briefing and hadn't thought to check the mounts. 2 flags had rotated sideways on their hooks. The divisional pennant had pulled free on one end and was hanging at a 45-degree angle, its lower corner touching the wall. Margaret straightened them, all of them. Not because she'd been asked, not because it fell under her assignment, because they were crooked, and she was the person in the room, and she could see it. She also measured the distance between each flag mount with a piece of string from the supply closet, noted that the spacing was uneven, 11 inches between mounts 1 and 2, 14.5 inches between mounts 3 and 4, varying gaps across the rail, and wrote that down in the maintenance log. Just wrote it down. Didn't do anything about it yet. The log was the thing that eventually drew attention. By February of 1988, Margaret had been keeping detailed maintenance notes in the Building 43 log for almost 10 weeks. The log was a standard Navy maintenance record, a green hardcover binder, lined pages, with columns for date, task, materials used, and completion status. Previous entries covered about a third of the available space with single-line notations. Mopped corridor. Cleaned head. Changed filter. Margaret's entries ran longer, not dramatically longer, not lengthy in a way anyone would call excessive. But she noted the dust accumulation rate in the ventilation grates and wrote down what day she'd last cleaned each one. She noted that the rubber seal around the door on Briefing Room B's north exit was cracked and had been since at least early December, and wrote the part number from the existing seal so maintenance could order a replacement. She noted the flags 3 separate times. The spacing issue, the torn canton, the condition of each grommet, and cross-referenced the dates. In March, a warrant officer named Dees came through the building on a routine inspection and picked up the log. He read it for longer than Margaret expected. He asked who was maintaining it. Hartwell pointed at Margaret, who was resetting the chairs in briefing room A. Dees came and stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know anything about flags?" She told him what she knew, which was that she had observed the flags in briefing room A were showing wear at the grommets on 2 ensigns, that the canton repair on the 3rd ensign was coming apart at the edges, and that the mounting rail spacing was inconsistent with standard display protocol by her reading of naval customs and courtesies. Dees looked at the flags. Then he asked her where she learned about display protocol. She told him she'd looked it up. He left without saying anything else. 3 days later, a package arrived at Building 43 addressed to Petty Officer Collis. Inside, 1 copy of Seknevinst 105206, the Navy's instruction manual for the care and display of flags. A handwritten note from Warrant Officer Dees that said, "For your reference, nothing else." Hartwell saw the package, didn't ask about it. That afternoon, he told her the flags in the wardroom and both briefing rooms were now her responsibility to maintain, in addition to her regular duties. She added it to her log. Margaret Collis had grown up in Calais, Maine. Her father had worked the border crossing on the U.S.-Canada line for 22 years. Her mother had run the household and, in the summers, sold handmade quilts at a craft market outside St. Stephen. Margaret had made flags as a child. Not naval flags, but pieced fabric banners her mother had taught her to sew during the winters when there wasn't much else to do indoors. She knew what a proper seam looked like. She knew what a failing grommet sounded like when you ran your thumb along it. She had been sewing since she was 9 years old. She had never mentioned this to anyone at Naval Submarine Base New London. The flags in Building 43 required more than cleaning. The 3rd ensign, the one with the iron-on canton patch, had a tear that had been worsening since December. The patch had lifted at both corners and was now holding on along a strip maybe 2 inches wide in the center. Left alone, the canton would tear completely within a few weeks. Margaret took the flag down, with Hartwell's knowledge, on a Tuesday in late March. She took it home that evening. She had a sewing kit in her quarters, a metal tin her mother had given her when she left for basic training in 1979, with 12 spools of thread in various weights, 3 needles, a small pair of shears, and a seam ripper. She removed the iron-on patch entirely. Cut a new canton piece from a remnant of matching fabric she found at a sewing supply store in Norwich, 17 miles north on Route 2. The remnant cost $3.40. The stitching took her 4 hours across 2 evenings. She returned the flag on Thursday morning, hung it back in its place, logged it, March 31, 1988, Ensign #3. Canton replaced. Grommets inspected. Sound. Material. Cotton bunting. Sourced commercially at $3.40. She filed the receipt in the back of the maintenance binder. By June 1988, she had repaired all 7 naval ensigns. The work was not quick. Each flag required assessment, checking the heading, the grommets, the stitching at all 4 edges, the condition of the finish along the fly end where wind and handling caused the most wear. 2 ensigns needed full heading replacements. 1 needed new grommets on both top and bottom. The divisional pennant had a stress tear along the hoist that had been stitched in the field at some point, crudely, with thread that didn't match the base fabric and had begun to fray. Margaret ripped out the field repair and did it properly. She kept a record of every repair. Date, flag, material used, time spent, cost, where applicable, 6 months of receipts, carefully folded, in the back of the maintenance binder. Total expenditure, $31.20. Her own money. She had not submitted a requisition form for any of it, had not known the process for doing so. had not asked. In the fall of 1988, Warrant Officer Dees stopped by Building 43 again. Not for an inspection this time. He came specifically to the supply closet and asked to see the maintenance log. He sat with it for a while. He asked about the $31.20. Margaret explained. Materials, her own funds. She hadn't known the requisition process. Dees closed the binder. He told her he was going to look into the reassignment that had placed her in Building 43, and he told her this the way someone tells you a fact, not a promise. Then he left the binder on the shelf and walked out. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Commander Foss was reassigned to a shore logistics post at Naval Station Norfolk. Margaret remained in Building 43. She stayed in Building 43 for the rest of 1988 and all of 1989. Not because no one offered her anything different. In January 1989, a chief petty officer from the Submarine Squadron Personnel Office came to Building 43 and told her there was a logistics technician billet opening up in the squadron. Told her she had the qualifications. Told her they'd like her to consider it. She asked for 2 days to think about it. She spent those 2 days finishing a repair on the command pennant for a decommissioned boat called Us Dace, a 2-foot tear along the diagonal stripe that required 17 inches of new fabric and nearly 5 hours of hand stitching to bring the color match close enough to pass inspection. She submitted the pennant to the log, then walked to the personnel office and told them she wanted to stay in Building 43. The chief looked at her for a moment, asked why. She told him she had unfinished work. He processed the paperwork. She went back to her corridor. The flag work had expanded by then. Warrant Officer Dees had quietly routed her name to the Base Flag Officer's Administrative Office, which maintained the inventory of ceremonial and official flags used across the entire installation. The inventory had not been audited in 4 years. Some flags had been cycled through the supply system and come back with minor damage that hadn't been caught at intake. Others had been in continuous display rotation so long that the fabric had simply faded from UV exposure, the colors washing out from deep navy and red to something closer to slate and rust. A faded flag on display at a U.S. Navy submarine base is not a small thing. It is noticed. Not always by name, not always by anyone willing to say so out loud, but it registers in the background of every photograph, every ceremony, every moment a visitor or crew member looks at a wall. Margaret was given access to the inventory in April 1989. Not an official posting, not a reassignment, just access. She audited all of it, 43 flags total. She rated each one on a 4-point scale she developed herself: serviceable, fair, degraded, unserviceable, and wrote the condition next to the inventory number in a fresh binder she'd bought at a stationery store in Groton for $1.89. 11 flags were serviceable. 14 were fair. 12 were degraded. 6 were unserviceable. She wrote up her assessment on 2 pages of standard Navy correspondence paper and gave it to Dees. He forwarded it to the base flag officer's office with a cover note. It was the first written condition assessment of the base flag inventory in the history of the installation. The work that followed was slow. Repairing a naval flag correctly is not the same as patching a sail or hemming a curtain. Colors are specific. Pantone references for navy blue, the exact red of the national ensign. The particular weight and weave of bunting that allows a flag to fly properly without drooping or distorting. A repair done with mismatched thread is visible up close. A heading sewn with the wrong stitch count will fail early. Margaret sourced materials through a flag manufacturer in York, Pennsylvania, called Annan Flagmakers. She had found their catalog in a filing cabinet in the supply closet, 2 years old, but the materials hadn't changed. She placed her first order through a requisition form Dees had showed her how to complete. $78.40 for thread, heading canvas, and replacement grommets. The order came back approved with a 2-week lead time. She started on the degraded inventory first, working 3 evenings a week after her building maintenance shift. The supply closet in Building 43 was 8 feet by 11 feet. She cleared the back half of it, set up a folding table, hung a clip lamp from the shelving bracket, and worked there from 1700 to 2000 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Hartwell knew. He didn't say anything about it either way. By December 1989, she had brought 31 flags from degraded or unserviceable to serviceable condition. By April 1990, the entire inventory of 43 was rated serviceable or above. She had spent $214.30 in Navy requisitions and $47.10 of her own money on materials she'd needed before the first requisition cleared. She had submitted a reimbursement request for the personal funds. It sat in the base comptroller's office for 11 weeks and then came back approved, $47.10, deposited to her pay account. She noted the reimbursement date in the maintenance log. May 14, 1990, that same month, a photographer from the base public affairs office came through Building 43 to take administrative photos for the annual installation report. He photographed the briefing rooms. He photographed the wardroom. He photographed the flags on the display rail in Briefing Room A. When the photos came back, the flag officer's office sent a copy of the briefing room photograph to Dees with a 1-line notation at the bottom, best condition in recent memory. Dees passed the photograph to Margaret. She put it in the maintenance binder, behind the receipts. She requested a transfer in June of 1990. Not back to logistics. She requested a posting to the Navy's Clothing and Textile Research Facility in Natick, Massachusetts, which at the time operated under Army jurisdiction but maintained a small naval liaison office for textile standards coordination. The facility researched materials used in naval uniforms, survival equipment, and, among other things, flag manufacture specifications. The request was unusual. The facility hadn't received a posted liaison from a submarine installation in 7 years. The last one had been an officer. Dees signed off on it. The base flag officer endorsed it. Someone in the Bureau of Naval Personnel looked at her file, at the maintenance logs, at the flag inventory assessment, at the $31.20 in personal receipts for Canton fabric and thread, and approved the transfer inside of 3 weeks. She reported to Natick on August 6, 1990. The work at Natick was different. She was working with engineers and textile scientists who had spent careers studying things like tensile strength, UV degradation rates in dyed cotton, and the effect of salt air on synthetic versus natural fiber blends. Margaret had spent 4 years in a supply closet in Groton with a clip lamp and a sewing tin from her mother. She did not pretend otherwise. She asked questions. She read everything they handed her. She took notes in a plain spiral notebook she bought from the facility commissary for 89 cents. At night, she read procurement specifications for bunting manufacture and compared them against the condition ratings she developed in her own binder, looking for the places where what the spec required and what she'd observed on actual flags in actual use didn't match up. There were several. A seam specification for heading attachment that worked fine in low wind display conditions failed faster than the spec predicted in the high wind, salt air environment of a waterfront base. A grommet standard that was adequate for parade flags was marginal for flags flown at sea or near shorelines with significant tidal moisture. Margaret wrote these observations down in a formal memo format in November 1990. 3 pages, single-spaced. Footnoted with reference to 4 specific flags from the Building 43 inventory, she still had the condition dates and repair logs. and 2 flags she'd examined at Natick from a sample collection. She gave it to the Naval Liaison Officer, a lieutenant commander named Sorensen. He read it, sent it up. In March of 1991, the Navy issued a revised specification for heading attachment seam construction and shore installation display flags. The change affected every installation that maintained a ceremonial flag inventory. The specification cited internal review and field observation data. It did not cite Margaret Collis by name. She learned about the specification change from Sorensen, who left a copy of the notice in her mailbox with a yellow sticky note that said, "Your numbers were right." She put the notice in the binder, added it to the index. The flag came about the way most things had come in Margaret's career, sideways, without announcement, from a direction she hadn't been watching. In the spring of 1993, she was still at Natick, now holding the rate of Chief Petty Officer, having made Chief in November 1992 after 14 years of service. She was working on a research comparison of 3 bunting suppliers: Annan in Pennsylvania, Valley Forge Flag in Spring City, Pennsylvania, and a 3rd mill in Tennessee called Defiance Flag Manufacturing, comparing their output against the revised 1991 specifications under controlled weathering conditions. The test involved flying sample flags on a 20-foot pole in the facility's outdoor test area for a 12-week period through winter and spring, with readings taken every 2 weeks on color retention, seam integrity, and grommet wear. One of the flags in the test, a standard naval ensign from the Annan production run, had a manufacturing defect in the fly-end seam that wasn't visible at intake. Margaret had noted it as marginal during inspection, but within specification. By week 4, the seam had opened 3 inches. By week 8, it had opened 9 inches. The flag was removed from the test and flagged as a specification gap. The existing standard allowed for a tolerance that, under real weathering conditions, permitted seams that failed before the rated service life. Margaret wrote this up, submitted it to Sorensen, who had been promoted to commander by then. He forwarded it to the Naval Supply Systems Command. In the course of the follow-up, someone in the supply chain office asked Margaret whether she could produce a pattern specification, a formal sewing diagram that showed the correct heading attachment, seam construction, and grommet placement for a standard naval ensign in a way that could be distributed to maintenance personnel at shore installations. She said she could. She produced it in 6 weeks. 12 pages. Diagrams hand-drawn and then photocopied, each one showing the stitch pattern, the seam allowance, the correct needle gauge for the bunting weight, and the grommet setting sequence. A repair guide, written the way her mother had explained sewing to her when she was 9, step by step, no shorthand, no assumptions about what the reader already knew. The supply command formatted it, added cover pages, and distributed it to 47 shore installations under a supply bulletin number. Margaret still had the original hand-drawn diagrams. In the binder, behind the receipts. She retired in September of 1995. Chief Petty Officer Margaret Collis. 16 years of service. The ceremony was held in a small conference room at Natick, attended by 14 people. The current liaison staff, Sorensen, 2 engineers from the textile division, and Warrant Officer Dees, who drove up from Connecticut in a Ford F-150 that had 160,000 miles on it and arrived 40 minutes before the ceremony started. He brought her a flag, not a standard ensign, a personal flag, a naval custom that allows senior enlisted personnel and officers to commission a personal command pennant for ceremonial display. The flag was small, the size of a pillowcase, in navy blue with a white border. In the center, a needle and a spool of thread, rendered in white stitching. her name along the bottom in block letters. Collis. He had ordered it through Annan Flagmakers, paid for it himself. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully along its heading edge, the way you fold something you intend to keep, and held it. She thanked him. He said it seemed right. In October of 1998, 3 years after her retirement, US Hartford, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine operating out of Groton, Connecticut, returned from a 6-month deployment to the North Atlantic. Standard arrival protocol, crew on deck, colors flying, the base awaiting at the pier. On the sail of the Hartford, flying from a temporary staff mount above the deck, a flag, small, navy blue with a white border. A needle and a spool of thread in the center. Collis at the bottom. The crew of the Hartford had heard the story from a chief who had served at New London during the late 80s. One of the junior sailors had tracked down Dees, who had provided the photograph and the dimensions. They had the flag reproduced by a shop in New London. A woman named Prakash who ran a textile business out of a storefront on Bank Street and had flown it on the return voyage as a tribute. They hadn't told Margaret it was coming. She was at the pier because Sorensen had told her there was something she should see. He hadn't said what. She saw it when the Hartford came around the bend in the Thames, the blue flag on the sail, catching the October wind off the river, snapping out full and clean and straight. She stood on the pier in a gray wool coat she'd had since Groton and watched the submarine dock. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The repair guide she wrote in 1993 is still in use. Revised twice, once in 2001. Once in 2009, both times by teams at the Naval Supply Systems Command who updated the grommet specifications and added a section on synthetic fiber blends. The core methodology, the stitch patterns and seam construction sequence she drew by hand at Natick has not changed. 47 installations in 1993, 89 installations by 2001. 112 by the time of the second revision. Margaret Collis lives in Calais, Maine, the town she left in 1979 to go to basic training. She has a sewing room in the back of the house that had belonged to her parents, with a worktable under the east-facing window and a steel shelving unit along the south wall where she keeps her thread in order by weight. She still sews flags. Not for the Navy, for herself, mostly, and sometimes for people who ask. Veterans, town governments, families who want something made properly and know there is a difference between properly and adequately. The blue flag with a needle and thread is mounted above the worktable. Dry cleaned once, in 2003. Reframed once, in 2011, when the wall behind it was repainted. Still there, still sound. Still flying.